Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our fifth of 5 sessions on writers writing the world with another author and activist who's passionately engaged in making our world a better place. As you all know, this is our last session for 2024. And we will be taking a break now at the end of this session through Monday, the 6th of January, when we'll be reconvening. And as I was pondering what I was going to say to close out the year, I realized that I wanted to make a comment related to the year in review. Because I think for me, there are two mega trends that are shaping our world fundamentally, that subsume all other trends in the human realm, as far as I can see. And the first one is that as our challenges get greater, principally climate change, the increasing prospect of nuclear war, and unfettered technological AI expansion, our governments are almost militantly disengaging from the kind of collective thinking and collective action that would solve any of our problems. I can't think of a single global problem or issue that's being satisfactorily dealt with at virtually any level. As our world seems to be careening almost intentionally out of control. I could speak volumes on the details, but climate change, the last 2 COPs have been presided over by oil ministers. War and peace, the world is essentially convulsing with war. Greater diversity between the rich and the poor. Public health, human health is continuing to erode. The United States finds itself now number 79 in terms of the health of its citizens, with 2/3 of its children suffering from chronic diseases, unprecedented in the history of humanity. And the paralysis deepens rather than gets ameliorated. Extraordinary phenomenon. The other phenomenon, which is beginning to take hold and is expanding rapidly, is the appearance on Earth of extraterrestrials. And 2024 marked a watershed year in humanity's interactivity, awareness of, and response to the phenomenon which has been loosely called the UFO phenomenon, the ET phenomenon, now called non-human intelligences and UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena. And that 2024 was the year in which it became incontrovertibly true that they're here. As Carl Nell put it, colonel, the U.S. Army, who's been involved in these things for many, many years. He says there's now zero doubt. Lou Elizondo, whose book Imminent is on the New York Times bestseller list, who was the head of the Pentagon agency studying UFOs, UAP, has stated categorically, echoing David Grush in congressional testimony last year, that yes, UAP and HI exist. Yes, the US government and other governments have retrieved craft. Yes, the US government and other governments have retrieved alien, what they call biologics. And yes, the US government and other governments have been engaging in a massive cover-up since 1945, wanting to keep secret the most important piece of information in the history of the human race, that we are not alone. And what I want to draw to our collective attention now is the way those two megatrends are beginning to interconnect. Because they're happening synchronistically. The one drawing us to our doom, and the other drawing us to an enlightenment. And it's happening in the skies over Europe and the United States so dramatically in the last month or so that even the mainstream media is beginning to wake up and to talk about it. And it can be encapsulated in the following way. When the United States escalated the war in Ukraine and sent US and British military personnel to shoot American and British warheads into Russia, escalating the dangers of nuclear war. Because for the first time, the United States and Britain became active combatants against Russia, crossing a red line that has endured since 1945. Almost simultaneously, massive numbers of what the mainstream media are calling drones appeared over the US military bases in the UK that contain the nuclear weapons, and over the eastern seaboard, over Washington, D.C., over President-elect Trump's golf course in New Jersey. And they haven't gone away. From the very beginning of the nuclear era, on the first day, when on July 16th, 1945, the United States ignited a nuclear device in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and then proceeded to drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, UFOs showed up. Robert Oppenheimer says there were orbs in the sky on July 16th. And if you've read Robert Hastings' book, UFOs and the Nukes, you can have the whole history of how the UFO phenomenon has been almost directly proportional to the dangers of nuclear war, including shutting down Minuteman missile silos and stopping US aircraft carriers and turning on and turning off missile silos in Russia and in China. And now, as the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist tells us that we're closer to nuclear war now than at any time in the nuclear era. Only 90 seconds to midnight. What's appearing by the hundreds every night, but unidentified anomalous phenomena. And whether it's the FBI or the CIA or the Department of Homeland Security or the White House or 10 Downing Street or the Chancellery in Germany, not a single official has any idea what's going on. And growing public concern is undealt with. So one of the things I want us to all pay attention to as the year ends is this cosmic dimension to human history. We are not alone, folks. That's the truest thing in the world. It's as true as the fact that the earth revolves around the sun. The ETs are here. And they've come here to warn us and to help us if we'll only look toward the sky with an open heart to guide us on our way. So even though this is the last session of the year, this phenomenon that's happening around the world is of such inordinate importance that we're going to be convening next Thursday on the 19th of December, a special session of Humanity Rising. Even though we're breaking for the holidays, next Thursday, same time, same station, we'll be sending the link out to everybody. We're going to have a special session on what's going on in our skies with these drones, because the phenomenon keeps escalating. Our solutions are staring us in the face. It's an extraordinary, it's actually high humor. If you're capable of humor under such dire circumstances. So thank you everyone for joining us here at Humanity Rising. It's been a great year. I've loved every minute of it. 2025, it promises to be even more dramatic, more turbulent, more chaotic, more illuminating, with greater and greater opportunities for we humans, blinded by our own ignorance and arrogance, to actually find our way forward. And now the heavens, the cosmos, has sent us agents to help us because we don't seem to be able to help ourselves. Isn't that an amazing thing? What grace abides in the cosmos for a small little blue dot in the middle of nowhere in a minor galaxy, that the cosmos actually cares about its own, to send first responders. It's a wonderful, wonderful moment in human history. It's the most potentiated moment in our history. So thank you. We'd like to now open up our discussion for today. I'd like to welcome Jennifer Browdy, who's convened this final program for Humanity Rising on writers writing the world. So Jennifer, thank you so much. It's been a brilliant week. You've assembled an incredible cast of characters, and now we have our grand finale, and I turn the program over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. You know, I'm glad you were able to bring that discussion of the ETs around to a place of uplift. You know, this is an extraordinary moment, and it's easy for us to become overwhelmed with all the negative details that are piling on us one by one every day. But I think you're right. We have to keep our eyes to the sky and the big picture, and the understanding that we are at a pivotal moment in history, in the history of our planet, in human history. And each of us has a role to play in becoming part of the tipping point that will push us in a positive direction. And I do believe that's going to happen. But my question, and I think I asked somebody this week that question, how maybe it was Manda, how low do we have to go? How far apart do we have to break before we start rebuilding and regenerating? And that's the uncertainty we're in now. So I want to introduce ORIELLE Lake today. I'm going to give her a brief bio, and then we will leap into her work. OSPREY is the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, We Can. She works internationally with Grassroots, BIPOC and Indigenous leaders, policymakers, and diverse coalitions to build climate justice, resilient communities, and a just transition to a democratized, clean energy future. She sits on the executive committee for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and on the steering committee for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. OSPREY's writing about climate justice, relationships with nature, women in leadership, and other topics has been featured in The Guardian, Earth Island Journal, Ms. Magazine, and many other publications. She's an award-winning author, and we'll be talking today about her most recent book, The Story is in Our Bones, How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. So OSPREY, do you want to come on camera? There you are. Yeah, welcome.
Hello,
welcome.
hi.
So, I think you have the word crisis in your subtitle there, and I think Jim has just described to us how the world is in crisis. And I know that you're somebody who I feel like you walk in two realms that are rather distinct and unusual to braid together. You do it in the book and you do it in your life. So the policymakers, you're sitting at the United Nations, you're at the COP meetings, you're at very high level discussions of climate justice and how to move forward in a sustainable, regenerative way. But you're also sitting with elders and Indigenous leaders and different kinds of mystics, and sort of open to that more metaphysical dimension of the crisis and how we can make change in that realm too. So I wonder, I would love to hear more about how you braid those different worldviews together and anything you want to tell us about either one along the way. So big question to get you going.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Jennifer, to this discussion. And I wanted to thank you for your vision in bringing all these writers together throughout this week. And just wanted to acknowledge, you holding this idea of bringing writers together. And just to mention, how much we can convey through our words and how important that is, because, when we write books, we can really take the time to unpack things at deep layers of storytelling and narrative and research. Speaking of weaving that you had mentioned, that is something that takes time. There was a time when we all sat around the fires, maybe not the Zoom fire, but the actual fire, and really took the time to understand things at a very deep level. And I mentioned that, just as a segue to your question, because I think there's a lot of complexity and depth to what is happening right now. And we need ways to slow down and to, I think in writing and reading and discourse, we have the opportunity to do that. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for creating this higher storytelling circle here this week, and invite everyone who's listening to maybe just take a moment and imagine sitting together physically and what it's like to be in community, to hold these spaces and these realms of change, from every extreme, from very, very difficult times to also the bright lights along the way. And thanks to Jim for Humanity Rising and the introduction. I think that it's really interesting that that's a thread that you pulled out, because sometimes people are perplexed about the different realms that I walk in. So I find it interesting that you asked that question. I think one thing that holds true for me is that it would be very possible and enjoyable for me to live fully in nature more than I do. I do live not in the city, but in Nevada, which is on the outskirts of San Francisco. So there's a lot of nature around me, but I could go much further into nature and be on the land and be very happy writing and researching and gardening and being with the plants and animals and living a very different life. Because I find my sense of alignment with those opportunities I have to really spend time deeply in the wilds, as I'm sure many people do. But the world is in, as we've been talking about, such a deep state of crisis that is also not in alignment for me to do that. And so I've really worked to live in different realms where I have that kind of space, but I'm very much called to the duty, if you will, of addressing so many interlocking crises, which has then, led me to develop the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, where we are doing a lot of different work, which, we can get into as much as you'd like, everything from working to stop fossil fuel pipelines, to reforesting different regions of the world, protecting forest areas. We do a lot of climate policy, as you mentioned, at the United Nations. We work particularly with women, Indigenous, Black, and Brown, and frontline women, as well as women at the highest level of government and financial institutions, to really create a different agenda and to ensure that frontline communities are represented. And also that we ensure that solutions are coming from the grassroots, from the ground, from the land, from knowledge sources of people who are Indigenous peoples and also frontline communities who are dealing first and foremost with these crises. So there's a lot to be said about that and why women's leadership is so crucial at this time. But I find that it's really important to weave these worlds because we need different kinds of interventions in these spaces so that we can bring different ideas to government leaders, to financial institutions that embed our values in a different way. And so those are sort of the crossroads of why I'm operating in these different realms, because we need to understand that, people at the highest level of government, as well as financial institutions, as well as corporations, are making very, very serious decisions about literally life and death for humans and the web of life on this planet. And so to be isolated from those conversations or to not create interventions, for me personally, is not possible. It's not for everyone. It's not everyone's cup of tea for sure. But I was asked certain questions when I was in Azerbaijan at the last COP, about our presence there. And a few things I was saying is that, I personally refuse to have governments meet and making decisions about the climate crisis, about biodiversity loss, about justice, about how these decisions are being made without civil society, without different kind of voices being in that space. I do not want them having that conversation without us, or things will be far, far worse. And I don't think that the COP or any of these spaces are where solutions are happening at the levels that they should be. But certainly we can prevent and have prevented a lot of bad decisions. And so it's very difficult being there, but I also think it's necessary that we bring our voices, our interventions, different ideologies, different worldviews, different mindsets into where actual decisions are being made. So maybe that gives you a little bit of background on some of that, the weaving of worlds.
Yeah. So what does that look like? I mean, I'm very interested in the environment. I have been for many years, but I can't imagine getting myself to a COP meeting and making an intervention. Like, I have no idea how that would happen. So how did you learn to do this, and what does it look like when you're there on the ground?
Wow. Okay. So Well, first of all, I don't want it to be so mysterious for people because it's everyday people in civil society who care, like everyone who's listening here. And maybe I'll just pick a few examples because there's so many layers to this. But one of the things that we do at We Can is that we often bring delegations of Indigenous and frontline women leaders who are representing their communities and bring them on a delegation to one of the COPs. It can involve, it usually takes all year to actually plan to go, to create strategies, to have trainings. We often bring policy briefs. Some of the things that are being discussed is what is a just transition, meaning how do we get off of fossil fuels and how do we get out of extractive economies into different types of economies, and how do we have a care economy, feminist economics instead of a fossil fuel economy. I'm very involved in presenting rights of nature as an alternative to the types of governance structures that we have now. I also sit on the steering committee for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is actually modeled after the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it has precedence in that sense. We were talking about nuclear issues earlier on through Jim's discussion. How do governments actually negotiate that? How do we actually have a negotiation around stopping fossil fuels? So there's a lot of preparation and meetings that go on all year to actually then go to one of the 2-week climate talks. And while we're there, there's different constituencies. We're part of something called the Women and Gender Constituency, which has its advocacy points, and there's many different constituencies. And so there's many different levels of ways to get involved. We are civil society observers. So there's different negotiating rooms going on, talking about different threads, as an example of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so, there's each COP, there are very specific tasks and focuses that governments are negotiating on. And so it's really impossible to follow all the tracks, but we usually follow several of the tracks. We follow the Just Transition Working Group. There's something called Article 6, which has to do with market mechanisms and whether or not we're going to continue the financialization and commodification in nature, which are things around carbon offsets and things that we don't agree with, which we can get into if people want to know more about policy. We also obviously, of course, follow the gender tract. And there are others. So we'll be in negotiating rooms and we'll be observers, and we're listening to negotiators from countries around the world. And then there's opportunities for the different constituencies to comment and have interventions. And then there's lots of opportunities to then go speak to individual negotiators and push for different advocacy points. So it's lobbying, in simple terms. But there's lots of other things going on. And there's side events where people are educating each other, where civil society's meeting, where there are very high level opportunities to meet country leaders, because one of the things that's very powerful about the COP is you have access. People are, high level leaders are walking around the hallways and you can go approach them. So there's, a lot of direct contact if you're really strategic. These side events are also collecting power and strategy and sharing knowledge with one another, which is very powerful for our global movements about how we're going to pressure governments and financial institutions. And also, I think it's really important at, kind of going upstream a little bit, to realize that when you go to the climate talks or the biodiversity talks, yes, we're talking about the climate crisis, but so much more is actually going on that is not about the climate crisis, because we're talking about gender equality to leaders from Saudi Arabia. There's incredible discussions going on about what is the just transition, what's actually working and not, forest protection. We're having discussions about patriarchy. We're having discussions about colonization. We're having discussions about extractive economies. So we're talking a lot about root causes of how we got into the crisis. On the sidelines, with people from all over the world who are trying to grapple with these very deep human conundrums. And so it's definitely not for everyone, but if you actually really engage, it's a very large conversation where you're at the few moments throughout the year where all world governments and small nations have the opportunity to speak on an equal level to every government in the world. And it is quite powerful in that way.
So you've been to many of these by now, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Over a decade of going to them.
And so do you have a feeling with this experience that, you know, are we moving in some positive direction? Is there anything hopeful or uplifting that's coming out of the latest COP?
Well, it's been really difficult. It's been really difficult. The last 3 COPs have been in countries that are led by fossil fuel, they're petrostates. They've also been really oppressive governments. So it's been extremely difficult because every time a COP happens in a certain country, the COP presidency has a great deal to do with the negotiations and the direction of those negotiations. So it's been very difficult. I will say, just to give some context, the 1.5 degree guardrail that's baked into the Paris Climate Agreement happened because of civil society intervention combined with climate vulnerable countries. So that was a huge win, really getting countries on board with that. Or in Egypt a few years ago when we won the Loss and Damage Fund, which is a form of really expressing climate justice and the need for countries that have really contributed the worst to the climate crisis to take responsibility for those countries that haven't, and help them not only with loss and damage because of the climate crisis, but help them with the transition to renewable energy. We did have a big win in when we were in Dubai, not this year, but the year before, on governments being forced finally to bring the topic of moving off of fossil fuels and talking about fossil fuels into the discussion. So we've had some big wins. I would say this year in Azerbaijan, it was probably the hardest COP I've ever been to. The topic with climate finance and governments, wealthy countries need to pay basically and take responsibility, for what has occurred unjustly. And it did not go well. I'll just put it that way. It was very difficult. And just to do some weaving here so we can maybe open up the conversation, I was moved at one level also just as things move to more and more intensity around where the world is going, and this contrast between things becoming more and more dire, while on the other hand, a lot of awakening is happening and a lot of breakthroughs happening as people realize that we need to be living very differently with one another and the earth. So these extremes are coming out in larger and larger visibilities. And so one thing I was struck with when I was in Azerbaijan is that Azerbaijan means place of fire. That's what the meaning of the word is. And when I was there, mostly I'm just, like everyone else, you're living and breathing in the space of the COP hallways. There's no windows, there's no nature, and you're just running around crazy, hardly eating and sleeping, just to be perfectly honest, working on these things. But usually I take a day or two and take some of our delegation to be on the land and to participate in culture. And we went to this fire temple right on the outskirts of the city of Baku. And one of the things that's really amazing about Azerbaijan is that it has enormous fossil fuels coming out of the ground, oil and gas coming out of the ground. And there's these mountains that have literally fire coming out of them because of the way nature has designed that land. And at this fire temple, you could see sort of the layers of colonization and the layers of our relationship with fire over centuries. It was at one point, the Zoroastrian people were there at this temple as a sacred holy site. And then later, Hindu pilgrims went there. And there are fires there that are burning continuously, once naturally from the earth, but now those have been extracted. So now the fires that are there actually have to be piped in through industry. But nevertheless, it's very beautiful there and very powerful. And they've taken some of this temple and turned it sort of into a museum, taking you through time. And I was very struck by that because one of the rooms shows you beautiful deities from different periods of time, like the Zoroastrian period and the Hindu period, where you see these deities and these goddesses of fire, goddesses and gods of fire, some of the culture. And you go to these different rooms to see these different eras, and really simple but put together very elegantly with different sacred objects, and the holiness of this respect for the element of fire. And then you go to the final room, and on equal stature and with equal pageantry, you see a room that uplifts images of oil wells and the industry. And it struck me so deeply in that moment, like, oh my goodness, we've gone from the fire as sacred and holy in a place where offerings and songs were there, to this deity of wealth and greed and extraction and exploitation, lifted up to the highest level of the gods and goddesses. And for me, it told the whole story. And it reminded me that, at the opening of the COP29 negotiations, the COP29 president from Azerbaijan said that oil and gas are a gift from the gods, but not in the way that we're talking about, but in the sense of exploitation, extraction, and financial wealth and gain. And so, without saying more, I think the story speaks for itself about this sort of development in our human consciousness of understanding the elements as holy deities to respect versus to exploit and extract. And in my book, The Story Knows Our Bones, I actually start, with looking at the stars in the universe, but also a story about fire. And I'll just close on this last point, which is how I became very fascinated with research that I did around fire and the element of fire, because when I did a lot of research around origin stories of fire all over the world, literally all over the world, it's the one element where the traditional stories from Indigenous peoples and communities around the world always say that the fire has to be stolen. People might be familiar with the story of Prometheus in the Greek mythologies, that stole fire from the gods and goddesses to give to humans. But we see this in the Amazon, the jaguar taking the fire and then sharing it with humans so that they can cook their food. Right here where I live at the Coast Miwok, have a story of the hummingbird going to the sun and taking some of the sun fire to bring to the people. And I could go on and on, but what's universal, which is really interesting, is all over the world, all different peoples coming up with the fact that the fire has to be stolen, not the earth, not the water, none of the other elements, the earth, no other elements have that tradition behind them. And as I really thought about it, it made me think about how fire is this incredible, beneficent being that we have evolved with to warm ourselves, to sit around the fire, to tell stories, to cook our food. But it is also the element that the deities were not too sure we should have, because it requires a great deal of respect and reciprocity, because it can do so much harm as well as good. So it's just a reflection that I really came back to when I was in Azerbaijan, is that research I had done around fire, and fire in the biggest sense of energy coming from the earth, the fires that can heal but also burn. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, fire cleanses, right? Fire restores. There's the phoenix myth, and it may be that the fires that we're seeing overtaking the earth now are part of that process of cleansing, like the earth herself cleansing herself of the imbalance that we humans have created with our greed. One of the things that I found most interesting in your work and most admirable is the way you have drawn from so many different cultures and allied yourself with so many different people, and particularly Indigenous people. And I would love you to say more about how you did that, and how you made those relationships, because it's really all about weaving relationships. And it seems to me that we need the wisdom of Indigenous peoples now more than ever, and yet it can be really hard as being from a settler background to make that approach and just get off on the right foot. I think you have a gift for it, and I'd love you to talk about how you do it.
Well, I just really want to honor all of the Indigenous mentors that I've had. And for me, the journey really began with in my youth, having, and I describe in my book my own, family disruptions, and learning that the best place I could get healing is from the land, from the forest, from the trees, from the earth. In my own journey to heal from what I think many people in our dominant culture are experiencing as a trauma, which is this it's not real, but a sense of disconnect from Mother Earth, from nature, from the land, and this sense of orphanage from our earth lineage, from belonging. And when we talk about these huge issues of, the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, war, the inequities that we face, for me, a lot of it comes to the fact of a sense of not belonging, and how through colonization, patriarchy, these different systems of oppression, capitalism, racism, when we go upstream, we really see this deep orphanage from who we are as human beings with the earth and the land, and being a part of the web of life. And all those traumas and disruptions create an enormous amount of violence and supremacy, and a sense of having to have some kind of identity that's more than, and othering, and all of these things, because of this deep void that comes from not belonging to our communities and to the earth, that has been going on for a very, very long time. And I start with that because that's where I began, is in my own disconnect, in my own sense of who am I, what lineage am I from, how do I relate to this earth and land around me? And in that search, realizing, oh my goodness, I'm not living on land where my ancestors come from. I only go back to, 2-3 generations here in the United States. My family's from Ukraine and came here because of the pogroms in Ukraine. And so, how do we then, as settler colonialists in other lands, become part of place when our own ancestors are not from where we live? And it's a conundrum we're all in. It's a story we're living right now in very tangible, complex, difficult, painful, joyful ways that are messy. They're messy, they're hard. And so, began that journey of understanding, here we are in this incredible United States of America, but it's also built upon, as we know, on the stealing of Indigenous lands, of the colonization and genocide of Indigenous peoples, and then on the backs of, people who were enslaved from different African countries. So this history still, it permeates our whole identity and presence here in the United States, because there has not been proper reparations and healing and reconciliation. And I truly believe that the deepest part of healing always comes when we go to the origin of illnesses and begin to unpack them, unwind them, and heal them step by step by step. No different when you go to the doctor and you have an illness. They can't just start giving you remedies. They actually have to find out, where is this coming from? What is the root of this, to truly heal in a balanced way? So that's sort of what began my journey, with wanting to respect and learn from the peoples whose lands I'm on, and what were their needs, what were their political requests, what were their calls to action, what harms needed to be remedied, and to be a listener, But why I started with the first part is it begins with us. It's not to go to Indigenous peoples to then extract and collect and try to fix our own void and orphanage, because it's just then perpetuates the same cycle of colonization and extraction. But to know first and start first with my own healing, my own search and research into my own family traditions, in my own heritage, which I share a lot in the book, and how I went about that research and work, so that when I do come sit with Indigenous peoples, even if my story is tattered and torn and broken and filled with atrocities, whatever that story is, I carry that with me. So I'm standing someplace on this earth with whatever I'm holding in my hand. And I think that's a big part of those relationship buildings, is to come with authenticity and honesty and with all that homework, if you will. And then to be really listening. And then on a very practical level, we need to realize that 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth, our forests, our waters, the land, is being stewarded by Indigenous peoples. And so it's either in their territories or being stewarded by them. So that should give us a clue about the fact that we need to be listening and sitting at the feet of Indigenous peoples and learning about that reciprocal, healthy relationship with nature at a time when we are, as a dominant society, destroying nature and bringing ourselves as a species to the point of extinction and damaging a huge, vast amount of the web of life in that process. And so I think that's part of the relationship, perhaps, that you're trying to get at, is that. And maybe I'll just end on that note with a story that I share in my book, where I come from, my family tradition in Ukraine. One of the stories that my grandmother told me before she died is that her grandfather, so my great, I'm not sure how many greats that is, grandfather to me, in a village outside of Kiev, was in charge of the cavalry, and he loved horses. And so he cared for the horses. And every year at the springtime, when it was time to plant the fields, there was a celebration to make offering to the land for a good harvest and fertility. And one young woman, a maiden from the village, was chosen to represent the spring maiden, and was, putting garlands in her hair and dressed in beautiful embroidered clothing, and would ride a horse around the fields in the village. And because my great grandfather was in charge of the cavalry, he got to choose the horse and lead the horse that the maiden rode on. And part of this also involved planting painted eggs into the planted fields as a symbol of fertility and success, of reciprocity with the land. Again, that practice of reciprocity, offering to the land for that exchange of the food that is grown. And I mention this because I've carried that tradition with me in gardens that I've grown, but also had the opportunity when I was invited to a very special ceremony with Casey Camp Hornick, who's a Ponca Nation elder, who's very, very close and sits on the board of Weekend, and we work very closely with her. I was invited to a ceremony in the Ponca Nation last year. And without going into details, I was able to gift one of these eggs to Casey and her community. And it was just a beautiful moment, because we talked in that moment about colonization, and if we could start redoing and changing the story and taking responsibility for the harms and the genocide and all of that. But then also what could be a moment of how we could begin to reclaim and rechange that story. And it all came about for me through the gifting of this egg and gifts that were exchanged. Anyway, so this is a little bit maybe an interwindow of that, but I think we need to understand, wherever we live, who are the Indigenous peoples' lands that we're on, and learn from them, know that they're here, and let ourselves be good listeners and listen to their leadership and uplift their rights and uplift their calls to demand, and understand that's critical for all of us.
Yes, I so agree. I'm so glad that you are helping to do this work. You know, you are a weaver in that sense. And kind of, I feel like you are somebody who's laying the planks of the bridge in front of us that we can follow you over. You're creating those bridges. So I really honor that in you. I wanted to talk about those moments in your book where you bring in or mention fairies or elementals, or, you know, little mystical experiences that you had in your youth. And I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously that was a choice to include those in the book. You could have not gone there, you know? So obviously these elementals are important to you. Yesterday we were talking with Cynthia Jers, and we didn't get a chance to, I didn't get a chance to raise the question with her about the dakinis that she includes in her book. And she, you know, she is also in communication with these more than human deities or elemental beings, right? So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with the more than human elemental fairy sprite world, and why you decided to include those moments in your book.
Well, I think it refers back to you know, what we're talking about, which is, I think, one of the things that is primary to this moment is that instead of seeing ourselves as separate from our living cosmology, amazing animate living earth, is how do we be in relationship to our relatives, the trees, the rivers, the fish, the birds, the mountains, the stones, wherever we live. And so, yes, I think it's a critical part of the paradigm shift that we're in right now. Is, I think many people are talking about this disconnect from nature and our need to reconnect with nature and how important that is. So how do we actually get into the details of what does that mean? What are those practices, and how do we actually move from the mindset we're in into a different worldview and a different relationship? And there's many ways to do that. And I think we're finding our way. And it does also connect to, you know, this idea of our ancestries and our lineages that we come from. And also doing this for me in a slow way, step by step, because I think there can be, you know, unfortunately, because many of us have grown up in capitalism and this idea of endless economic growth models and overconsumption, this idea of connecting with nature can be also co-opted into consumerism and a furtherance of an ideology that actually takes you further away from nature, you know, trying to commercialize this idea of connecting with nature. So I would just suggest also, again, to slowing down into, you know, keeping things very simple. What is the relationship I have with the trees right outside my front door? Do I even know the names of the trees right outside my front door? In the morning, I heard different birds singing. What kind of birds are those? What is their language? What are they doing? What are their patterns on a seasonal basis? So for me, it's a lot about, like, how do we actually be in the practice, not just in the intellectual understanding that we need to connect with nature, but actually changing who we are as human beings to become part of the animate cosmological world that we live in. So that, I think, is really critical, and why I was bringing up so many of those stories in the book, is just my relationship with the trees, my relationship with the deer, my relationship with the whales, you know, and how to take time to actually get to know who these beings are. I know that there was a study that was done where young people can identify, you know, if you just give them like a logo with no name on it, a logo of some brand, commercial brand, they can identify immediately, oh, that's this company, that company. But if you walk them outside the front door, they can't name but one species of a flower or plant. And so I think this kind of reflects the fact of where we need to be educating ourselves, where we need to be putting our attention into moving away from physical material stuff into actually where do we live. And I think many people, all of us, because of our dominant society and how we've been taught, have unfortunately not made those connections. Many people live in urban environments where it's very difficult also to connect with nature, but it can be done. There's, community gardens, the stars overhead. There are parks. I think it's difficult, but we also have to keep recentering the earth and everything that we're doing and building those relationships. I would also just say that, while I think we also need to put deeper value and respect on the magnificence of life that we have also lost, which also creates more violence and dominance and supremacy. Because I think we have forgotten, as an example, last week, I had the great opportunity, because there's been a lot of rains here in Northern California. The salmon runs are quite strong this year, and I live near Lagunitas Creek. And there's been a huge loss of the salmon runs because of urbanization, because of the dams, because of pollution, because of colonization. And over years, the tribal communities here and environmentalists and activists and community members have been restoring those riverways, those creeks. And I was able to see, these incredibly beautiful Chinook or the more commonly known king salmon spawning. And just the magnificence of that, and that this needs to become normalized, that we talk about the magnificence and beauty and inspiring gift of life that is around us all the time, instead of like, oh, just some fish. I went for a walk in nature and saw some fish. Wait, that should be as startling as, the UFOs coming. Seriously, at that level, like to see the magnificence of where we live, because the spawning is going on. And then it's an incredible cycle, because right after the fish spawn, they die. Their last act is to give birth to the next generation. It's phenomenal. And that they swim out at the Pacific Ocean for thousands of miles and still come back to the stream. They can recognize the stream that they were born in. And then when their bodies give away, they bring unique and necessary nutrients that only come from the ocean into that forest ecosystem that feeds the redwood trees and the rest of the forest. And so this entire incredible cycle is going on that generates life. And it can just be so minimalized as not important. But lifting up that kind of sophistication, that beauty of nature, I think is also part of the healing moment that we're in now. To recognize, where do we live in this incredible planet, in space, in the universe, and continue to situate ourselves in that origin story is critical to our well-being right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess I asked the question about fairies and sort of the metaphysical beings, because very often that cycle of life is presented in scientific terms. It's like, oh yes, the salmon go out, they come back, they fertilize the trees give us water or air, and then that scientific representation just doesn't seem to do justice to the true beauty and extraordinary multidimensionality of the world that we live in. And I think it is represented somewhat in the term Gaia, and Gaia is a term that you use. And so I think your book, this is part of the weaving that impresses me in your book, is that you have the science, you have the policy, you have the very, boots on the ground kind of, this is what we need to do. But you're also willing to give us glimpses into your interior life and your connection with the natural world that is transporting. I don't know, it's otherworldly. And so I want to honor that in what you do. And I think it must be part of what's fueling your success, if I can call it that, what's propelling you to be such a powerful actor in this complicated world we live in and really make change. So I think, just tell me if I'm on the right track, that when you give these nods to, let's say, that moment in your childhood where the arrow penetrated your umbilical cord, or the moment in the forest where you felt like a fairy was calling you. Those are like little goddess winks you're giving to the other world. Is that so, or am I making that up?
Um, I love how you're, it's a very interesting reflection. So thank you. I mean, I guess for me, it's all connected. I would agree with everything. I don't know, a wink, I would say a full-on arm embrace. So just expanding that a little bit, because you know, I experience them all happening at the same time. And you know, when I'm in a policy space, I am thinking about the redwood forest where I grew up, and the times that I have sat with those magnificent redwood trees and learned from them, just from sitting and listening to them, these ancient being, you know, if you go further up north in California, there's still some really deep old growth that are so gigantic. It's hard to imagine how big these trees are. They're the tallest trees in the world, but also just their girth. And to just sit with these beings quietly, and the kind of thoughts that you have when you're with them are different than when you're at the ocean, or different when you're sitting with the fire, or different than sitting in a city building. I mean, it definitely influences you to listen to these living ancestors. You know, they are our relatives. We come from the trees, you know, which is why I think it's so important to again emphasize, and I do in the book a lot, origins, origins, origins. You need to keep going to the origins of well-being, as well as the origins of the disruptions and ruptures that need healing. So, you know, in terms of origin stories, you know, I think this is important for us to come back to remember, in the story of evolution, as you say, it is a scientific story. We need to understand the science, but it is also deeply spiritual, that we literally come from the stars, not just metaphysically, but also metaphysically. We come from the elements of the stars, and then the development evolutionary of all the different cells and so forth. But, you know, when we sit with the trees, they're literally our relatives, our ancestors, the animals. And so when we can tune into our relationship at that level, there's so much to learn and to be communicated at other levels that are important, not just now, but forever. It's one of the reasons we're out of sync and out of alignment, because we haven't been listening to our relatives and building those relationships. And I'm thinking about all of that whenever I'm doing whatever I am in these policy spaces or the projects that we're doing, that it's part of it. I'm listening to the relatives and bringing them into these spaces with me. And so I think it's important that we bring our full selves to every discourse as much as we can, as part of the healing process, but also inviting new ways of thinking and new ways of approach. Because there are, you know, when I'm talking about the other realms, it's not at a different time. It's happening in this time. And I also begin that sort of understanding of time and the bending of time at the opening of the book, where there, you know, we're not sort of like in this reality, and then, you know, tomorrow I'm in that reality. I'm walking in the forest, I'm in one reality, and then another reality, I'm, you know, in the halls of some lobby group in Washington, D.C. No, they're happening at the same time if I allow myself to be there. And I just want to share, you made me think of something, and then I'll close this comment. I was just looking at something because I was doing another research paper, but one of the things I like to think about in our origin stories is looking at our pre-colonized and pre-patriarchal ancestors. And again, that's a very big topic, but I just wanted to touch upon it for a second, because when we're talking about ancestries, yes, I'm talking about like how we could follow our family tree and all the things that can develop from there that are both painful and beautiful, and things we need to be responsible for, and reparations that need to be made, but also encouraging us to go into when our own ancestors were close to the land, indigenous to the places they were. So pre-colonized, pre-patriarchal societies that we all come from, that were not perfect, but were certainly egalitarian and connected us to the land. Going to those origins is key, because it helps us build strength from ancestors that we all hold. And I was looking up this one word that I really love, and I'll just share briefly. Our pre-colonial Irish peoples developed and spoke a language that, like most antique languages that we come from, was not limited to things that they could touch and see. So there's this beautiful world, it's called Chantar, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but Chantar is a word still used in modern Irish, meaning place, but its opposite, altar, meaning the other realm, has fallen out of use in our overly demythologized times. I'm just reading directly from my book for a minute. Irish language encompasses the two worlds that exist at once. While organic matter exists in the Shantar, our minds can wander between the two realms. So, there's these words that are, when we look at some of our languages that actually speak about what we would call, quantum physics now, very easily, about the realms existing at the same time. But we've lost some of those meanings of those words as we demythologize and kind of despiritualize our language, that I think we need to reclaim and repossess so that we have the ability to be in these realms all at once and not be in these different isolated silos that then isolate our minds from being able to be fluid and more full human beings in our interactions and how we relate to everything from governance to gardening to our relationships with each other to our walks in nature, where we can be in different realms at once. And so, as you know, in some of my book, I go deeply into language to help us reclaim being in these realms and accepting that they're happening simultaneously.
Yeah, beautiful. That's beautiful. And I appreciate all that you talk about in the book in terms of language and story and narrative, and how critical it is that we, as you say, reclaim the pre-patriarchal older forms of linguistic relationship to Gaia. That, human beings, I think all species have their own language. Human beings are particularly adept at language and story. And so it's a gift that we have that we should be using wisely and intentionally. And that's part of my idea of writing to write the world, which you do so well. So on that note, let's bring Jim back. So I think he's got some more questions. And there are questions in the audience. We've had a very engaged audience. So I'll also be looking over the chat. Hi, Jim.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, OSPREY. Deep and wise as usual. I want to turn to a couple other issues that are important as I read your book, that I think are worth contemplating. And the first one is the importance of ritual. I think that we often, think of Indigenous mind and, and Gaia as abstractions, and the use of ritual from time immemorial, actually, and across cultures has proven to be a very potent way of bridging realities. And you spent many, many years in ritual. So I would just love to hear you speak to the importance and power of ritual.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that when we set aside sacred time, that whether we call it ceremony or ritual or spiritual practices, because I think people maybe have different terminologies for the interaction that you're speaking about, it can be a time where we are respectfully having a heightened awareness of being in the different realms. And, it allows us to open up to the realms of spirituality in very specific ways, because, we're not trying to have the time when we're, doing our laundry or doing our work on the computer, you know, all the things that make up our daily life, which are also small ceremonies if we choose to do them intentionally. They're all important. But, you know, we set aside time and say, you know, this is going to be time where we are going to really listen to ourselves, listen to the land, and whatever that particular ritual or ceremony or practice is focused on, it can really allow us to deepen those relationships and listen in different ways because we are intentionally setting that time aside specifically for that. And it also allows us to, I think, have a opportunity to listen to the deities, you know, talk about not, you know, being only human centric, to really understand that the forest, the waters, the oceans are alive and they're speaking in their own language. And if we don't stop and listen, then we're not really attuning ourselves to the needs of the land and the different aspects of the different elements. And I think when we have that time in ceremony and ritual, we are inviting that relationship.
Mhm.
I think that's one component. Another huge one is around reciprocity and offering. It for me, a lot of ancient ceremonies were so much, and the practices I'm engaged in, it's not just about taking what we need. Oppositely, it's about the fact that we have this huge gift of being on this amazing planet that has designed herself that we can breathe and live and eat and live our lives in this incredible magnificence. And what is our offering to the land? So ceremony often is about offering. It's about what are we giving, whether
Mm.
that's physically making something and giving that back to the land, or being in celebration and song, you know, and dance to thank the sun, to thank the trees, to thank the, you know, herbal medicines, to thank life that we get to be in life. And I think a big, huge part of what we're missing is the fact that ceremony and ritual is based on offering, not what we can take. What do I need for me? What do I need to give? To reciprocal, to express my reciprocity and thanksgiving for being alive and being part of the web of life. And what do the forests around me need? What could I be giving? And this is very, very, very different many times from
Mhm.
dominant culture's understanding of ritual, which is I need healing, which we do, but also to understand that our healing is contextualized in what we can offer and what we can give and what is our place in the web of life. So yeah, those would be just some first reflections.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, this notion of ceremony and ritual as offering rather than taking, I think is a fundamental insight of the indigenous peoples everywhere. You know, and if you think of the rituals increasingly as we became civilized and detached from nature, a ritual became pomp and circumstance, and a process whereby you extracted whatever you needed from the gods. So I think you're making a very important point. So thank you for that. And then I think the final question that I would like to have you expand on is your title. I love your title, that the story is in our bones. And I would love to have you tell us, how did you come up with that title? What do you mean by the story is in our bones?
Thank you for asking that question. So yeah, I wanted people to, you know, let's start at a very practical level, you know, inside our bones, inside our bodies, you know, it is one of the centers where our DNA exists. And it's also where our blood is made every day. Everybody sort of knows from basic science that that is going on. But you know, I was thinking about how we're in a time where we are world making. We need to remake culture that is healthy and just. And so I was thinking about how the bones inside of our bones, we also often think of them as sort of like if you see a skeleton, like that's death, but actually your bones are where your blood is made every day, and how it's a place of world making. And so the story in our bones is also a story of world making right now, because the world we're in is collapsing. And I think we need to accept the fact that falling apart is okay. You know, I began with this idea that we had to fix the world. In some ways, I think we need to help the world fall apart. And I don't mean in ways that harm frontline communities or those who are already experience huge injustice, or Indigenous peoples who say the world has already ended. You know, people are talking about the end of the world, like, excuse me, you know, since colonization, our world already ended. We've already lived through the end of the world. This is not new. And so I wanted to lift up, okay, while one world is ending and burning, another world is being made. And that story is in our bones, both physically with the blood making, if you will, but in our blood memory, but also the fact of how, again, this idea of going to our origins in our DNA are the stories. So I shared some of those earlier about if we go back to these fire stories I talked about at the beginning of the conversation, the goddesses and gods were warning us about fire. They didn't warn us about water. They didn't warn us about earth. They didn't warn us about air. They warned us about fire. And so if we go back to our origins, again, those stories in our bones, the stories from our ancestors, we can pick up that story again. Because I don't think we can really unpack this moment without going back to our origins, without understanding that we too were indigenous to place at one time. And then these systems of oppression came in, which I don't have time to go into. I spent the whole book writing about, but like going through that journey of reclaiming what happened, becoming knowledgeable about what happened in our own ancestries, our own DNA, our own development in the earth lineage, good, bad, and the ugly. And then how do we generate this moment in our narrative? Because we can't keep building on top of something we don't know. Once we can name and claim it, we can heal it and we can transform it. And so the stories in our bones helps us reflect back on, oh, I need my own story. And how did my story develop from the far past to the present so that I can stand here in my full self? I've been in different ceremonies where the entire point of the ceremony, and this is common all over with Indigenous peoples around the world and our own ancestors, every year you told your origin story. If you look at all the great, spiritualities of the world, it's the telling of the beginning of time in our cosmology, walking us through to today. And you don't do that once. Like we do science class, when we're in third grade and we learn about the evolution of the universe, then we never talk about it again. No, every year, because it helps us remember that we're on a living planet and we're part of this earth lineage and this evolution. And so I'm a real proponent of going back and in ceremony, going back through time to today, because again, it creates that time continuum that we're part of this great unfolding story in a nonlinear time. And so that story literally is in our bones. The minerals and the elements of our body, as we talked about, come from the stars. This story is inside of us, but it is also happening all around us. So the stories in our bones is a way to help us to connect ourselves in an embodied way with this unfolding story that is in crisis, but we can also heal it through the origins of who we are.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. I love the rarefied nature of your intelligence. It always inspires me every time. So thank you. Thank you very, very much.
And Jim, I wanted to just comment one thing, if you don't mind, before we go, is because I know that you've been talking so profoundly and researching about the extraterrestrials. And I don't want to not, make that bridge, which is
please.
That I am not an expert on it whatsoever. I just wanted to make a reflection and learn from people who are experts. Is, on the one hand, being someone who's fighting every day to stop harmful projects, everything from, furthering the growth of nuclear power, which is now actually starting up again because of AI demanding power. So we're now back into our anti-nuke fights all over again in new ways, to getting off this fossil fuel industry, to stopping deforestation. So involved very much in trying to protect as much biodiversity as possible. It's my everyday focus. My day job every day is deep in this. So the idea of, sort of inviting in some other entity that could stop a harm, of course, is very exciting for me to think about. And so that's very interesting. Some other forces, and some of these crazy people who now have so much power are not listening. But I want to reflect that I don't think it actually changes the dynamic, that even if like there's forces that stop, a nuclear war, let's say, as I've reflected upon, like, what if we ended fossil fuels tomorrow? It doesn't change the mindset of the dominant culture that is based upon supremacy, exploitation, extraction,
Absolutely.
and the frontline communities, Indigenous, Black, and Brown people who suffer the most and are fighting for their very lives. So simultaneously, no matter what gifts we get from the heavens or anywhere, we still have deep work to do around changing our worldviews and who we are, and changing these ideologies of white supremacy and privilege and all the rest of it in terms of not being a reciprocal society. And so I just wanted to say that it no matter how much help we get, we still have to do this work. Still have to do this internal work. And I just wanted to add that, and I think that you are very much in alignment with it, but I just think that it's so important to always think that we're not going to be saved. We can be helped, but we still need to evolve and mature as a species internally.
Totally. I couldn't agree. And I want to underscore that with a comment. And then, Jennifer, I'll turn to you, because I'd love to have you summarize the week. Summarize the jewels that you've selected in that mind of yours from the week. But I think, OSPREY, you're making a fundamentally important point, and I'd like to respond in the following way. Elon Musk, who, if you heard the news yesterday, his fortune has topped 400 billion. He was on Joe Rogan about a month and a half ago or so, and he came on the show with a T-shirt that says "Occupy Mars." And what's important for us all to take in, everyone, is that what OSPREY just said is in some ways the $64,000 question. How do we save ourselves by changing the mentality that is destroying ourselves? When we're on the verge of such technical capacity, we can go to the moon, we can go to Mars, we can go to asteroids, and all we can think about is how we mine them and exploit them for profit. We're going out into outer space like Cortez came into Mexico in 1521 to conquer the Aztecs. It's the same mentality. And so how we grapple with that the problem is, right in the human psyche. It's not external to the human psyche, is the challenge of the ages. Now, but it's also the acute challenge of our interactivity with the ETs. And I want to raise this and make one more point. Everyone all the time says to me, since I'm here in Washington working on disclosure, right? They say, well, listen, why don't we get the ETs to land on the White House lawn? Take over the US Capitol. If they're that advanced, they could have taken over at any point, but they're not. In fact, they're remaining gossamer. Like even this current manifestation, it's gossamer. You track it and it disappears. It circles. There was a story that it was circling a Coast Guard boat by dozens. And as soon as they started to do something about it, they all disappeared. Why are they so gossamer? Well, to OSPREY's point, part of the prime directive that of whatever systems governing our quadrant of the galaxy is you can't come into a planet like Cortez went into Mexico. You have to subtly work with the indigenous populations because they need to always, in the end, preserve their autonomy. You know, and as I'm hearing that from more and more people who are called experiencers, the ones who've had intelligible communication and interactivity with the ETs, the more I'm realizing that they're here to help us. They're not going to solve it. And we may end up destroying ourselves in spite of they and Gaia and the world, you know, religions, traditions that seek us to just simply love one another. Because in some mysterious way, what's happening is both a crisis of human immaturity and an opportunity for human maturation to the point where we can catalyze this transition from this notion of human superiority to sacred reciprocity. And I have a feeling that our generation is going to make that transition or not. And therefore, I think this is in many ways the most exciting time in all of history to be alive, because all the trains are coming in at once. They're all leaving at once. And it's the equilibrium of the human psyche that is going to determine our fate. But what we can know is that even the heavens, like Prometheus of old, are giving us fire. They're giving us the way to solve it with an ingredient, with an element that can also catalyze our doom. What an incredible miracle of human history that's being played out. It's extraordinary. So OSPREY, thank you so much for your depth today. I always appreciate it, as I said. Thank you. And now, Jennifer, why don't you close us out with whatever comment you would like to make with the daunting task of trying to summarize 5 points of brilliance.
No, I did ask Georg to provide me with the raw materials so I can make transcripts, so I can sit with the brilliance and maybe do some writing on my Substack about it, so people can look for that. But you know, I think we started with Maria Serrois, who is a positive psychologist, and we were talking about the importance of our own approach to reality and how we can control how we respond, even if we can't control external events. And then as we move through the week with Nina Simons and Manda Scott and Cynthia Jers and now OSPREY Lake, we're weaving together the inner and the outer realities. And I think that is what we're being called to do. And I agree with OSPREY. You said first thing out today, you were saying it takes time. And I was reminded of Bayo Akamulafe's oft quoted comment, the times are urgent, we need to slow down, right? So we, you know, taking the time to meditate, to write, to take in information and try to understand it from many different angles, as you are doing here, Jim, trying to see the bigger picture amidst all these details and weeds. I think all of our guests this week are engaged in that and are leaders in that kind of work. And we need to be receptive. So I think the greatest resource right now is attention, actually. You know, people are always pulling on us and trying to fracture our attention into a million different slivers, you know. Focus is the hardest thing, especially for the young people that I work with at university and for myself. So I think these 5 women writers have shown us by example what we can produce when we focus, when we slow down, when we take the time to really absorb our own experience and to integrate it with the larger Gaian experience that we're embedded in. And, especially in the case of Amanda Scott, she's so involved in trying to get us to use our wonderful imagination to envision the better world that we want to bring into being. Because all the activism, so much of it is reactive, pushing against what we don't want. And I think we do need to spend more time envisioning what we want and moving towards it in whatever small steps we can take, one word at a time, one sentence at a time, one action at a time. So thank you so much for the privilege of being with you this week. It's really been great. And I hope we'll do it again.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, OSPREY. That'll do it for us for today, everyone. And as it turns out, that'll do it for us for the year as we close out Humanity Rising until January 6th, with the one important exception of next Thursday, where we're going to be contemplating what on earth is happening with all these drones in our skies. That'll be next Thursday. We'll send out all the links to everyone. You can join the link for the after chat for today. You'll see it in the chat box, and you received it in your Zoom reminder that went out earlier this morning. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, OSPREY. Thank you, Jennifer. Love to everybody. Have a wonderful holiday. And take OSPREY and Jennifer's advice. The more urgent it is, the more you just got to slow down, love your family, eat lots of healthy food, sit by the fire, go to the beach, and then come back into 2025 ready for the ride of your life. Because the drama will only intensify. I think we can all agree on that. Thank you, everyone. Love you all. See you in the
Bye-bye.
new